Hi, welcome to the State of the Nation. I'm your host, Mike Sham. Joining us today, we have something we haven't had on this channel before. We've had a lot of politicians, we've had a lot of analysts, but now I think it's safe to say we've got a community activist, especially somebody looking at democracy. Joining me today from the Rivonia Circle, Tessa Dooms. Tessa, welcome to the State of the Nation.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
Tessa, I've been sort of, as I do, stalking you around on social media and various platforms where you've been visible. And you are passionate about democracy, right? And the activism around there. You currently, as I mentioned, at the Rivonia Circle, but you've been in this space for some time.
Yeah, I became an activist when I was about 15 years old. I'm from Eldorado Park, and my father is a pastor. So I grew up in a church community and grew up in a community where my family, my parents, the people in my church were connected into communities, coming together, working together, helping build community. So I consider myself an activist from that point onwards. I've worked in academia. I was a sociology lecturer for many years. I've moved into civil society spaces. I was a national planning commissioner at some point. So I've worked across spaces, but what's been consistent has been two things. One is that I believe in people and communities and their ability to organize and drive change on their own terms. And number two, I believe in young people. I consider myself an advocate for young people and youth. I'm no longer a young person, so I can't be an activist, but I certainly can advocate for young people's development, their change, and their leadership in our society. So, I work at communities, with communities, and for communities.
Well, you're certainly younger than some of the people involved in this interview, eh? So,
well, yeah, I'm younger than a lot of people who are involved in a lot of things in South Africa, including governance.
I'm here to make you feel young again, but to go with your start-off point, and that is empowering communities to build their own communities, right? Manage their lives. We live in a country where, with a government that gives absolutely no value to communities building their own communities, right? It's all about the government in South Africa, the way we've been ruled for 80 years. We've had one nationalist government handing over to another nationalist government that believes that the only way to make our lives better is for the government to do it.
Well, I believe that too. I just think that our conception of what government is limited. So I'm a firm believer in government. I believe that you need a good government, a strong government, and a devolved government, I think, is the thing that we don't talk about enough, right? Yes. So if we think about government as only people who work for the state, if we think about government as only the politicians or only people who are elected, I think that that's a limitation in terms of government. And also, if you think about government only as kind of national government and this very top-heavy approach to governance, I think that's also problematic. But I do believe in government, absolutely believe that you need a center that holds. And where we've missed the plot is not in having a government that is strong or expansive. It's having a government that is responsive to people, that is representative of people, and where people, as the communities that they are, can make sure that their issues are represented, their voices are heard, they can trigger accountability on their own terms, and the work that they do in their communities is plugged into their government rather than something that's happening parallel to government.
Now, it seems that community involvement in South Africa, certainly over the last 20 years, has been every now and again you block off a road and light a fire in the middle of the road, a few tires burn and rocks go around, you throw a few stones at policemen. You're talking about a different kind of community activism, aren't you?
I mean, so I'm team protest. I will join a protest any day of the week, any time. I think I've been 5 protests this year, so I'm team protest. Number one, I don't think that's been the only form of community participation and activism in the country.
Do you think protests are helpful?
Oh, absolutely.
So you're saying that that's the best way to get through to government to protest?
It's not the best way. It's not the only way. And I don't think that's the only thing that's happening right now. But I think protests have an important function in our society. Number one, protests give people an opportunity to organize themselves around their issues. Protest is also about disrupting systems that don't work. And sometimes we allow systems just to continue on and plod along. And, there's no protest action, and I can tell you this from many experiences that people have in their communities. There's no protest action that starts on the day with the protest. Protest is always a culmination of people trying other means to engage governments, businesses, and people in power and engage the system and work the system. And protest often becomes a last resort when the system is unresponsive. And so I think also for amplification of voices and awareness, protests are, and we don't even have to call it protests. On Friday, the National Youth Coalition is hosting what they're calling a youth parade, which is bringing together about 3,000 young people to march in the streets, not in protest because they've realized that no one is listening to them, but in order to create awareness among other young people about the power of young people to change things. So I believe that protests, in terms of disrupting systems and getting us to focus on issues, are really important. But I don't think they're the only game in town. I think communities have been acting in various ways. There are so many community-based organizations and individual community organizers around the country who wake up every day in extremely constructive ways to organize themselves to help in their communities, to organize themselves to help with healthcare, to help with crime initiatives. We're seeing a lot, we're not seeing a lot of the work that gets done at community level, where thousands and thousands of community organizations exist that are unfunded, that are not regulated by anyone because they're not big enough or they're not, they don't have all of the compliance and checks and balances in place, but are doing good work. And what we see is protest, and that's why people go to protest, because it's the only thing we value. The only time we're listening to communities and their direct action is when they're burning something down. So we're creating a culture of that by not looking when communities are doing things that are constructive on a daily basis.
So quite clearly, I come from a background of no protests or very few protests.
Sure.
But a lot of delivery in a South African context.
Sure.
Right? And given my background, and I'm sure many people that are joining us today would understand what I mean, the idea of protesting in the street, etc., is very, very far from where we go, and it's very, very easy to say, you protest and then what? The government eventually squashes it, gets on news. Tomorrow there's a new protest. Life moves along. What do they say? A circus leaves town, and the dogs bark, and that's the end of that. I question the effectiveness of it.
I think the fact that we're talking about it is already evidence that it's effective. Because protest is meant to make us stop and stare. And that's the thing that we do, right? But here's also the other thing.
But an accident also makes us stop and stare. It doesn't undo the accident.
Absolutely. But protests are about getting people to understand that there is a problem and trying to direct attention to that problem.
So would you say that these protests lead to action from our leaders?
Not necessarily, because protest in isolation, in any context, is not going to be enough. Protest has a very particular role, and then you have to do other things around it. You have to come up with a plan. And communities then have solutions on the table that they need to have enacted, which means that they then get into modes where they can then have debates, have conversations, move things along. So I'll go back to my home community, Eldorado Park. Eldorado Park has been fighting a war on drugs for years. And intermittently, protest has been a part of that. Intermittently, last year there was a protest for a number of weeks with people protesting in front of the police station to get changes made to the leadership of that police station. Those changes have been made. That protest was effective. But it was also effective because there was a clear plan. There was a clear set of demands. The community was also having community meetings in different areas. We're calling on politicians. They did a lot more work than the thing that made it to the news, which was the protest. So again, protest in isolation, no. But you must keep every tool must remain on the table. We must expand, and this is one of the things we talk about at Rivonia Circle when we talk about new politics. Most people think we just mean new parties. We actually mean that we must expand the toolkit of what it means to take direct action. So yes, direct action through protest is important. Direct action through putting down solutions is important. Direct action to making sure that we go to all of the meetings that are available, or that we demand that the meetings happen, the IDP meetings, that the mayoral committee that hasn't shown up for 18 IDPs, that they actually show up for those IDPs, that we actually know what the budgets are and that we have input into those budgets, that we hold our ward councillors to account and ask them for the minutes of the meetings that they attend, that we make sure that MPs who say they have constituency days and constituency offices actually show up at those offices. So we need plans for direct action, and we've seen it in our work. We've done about 70 democracy builders. These are workshops in communities where communities then have conversations about democracy, what it is, how it works and functions for them or not, where they talk about what the issues are they want to solve, not the issues are they want to complain about, the issues are they want to solve. Then they talk about the South Africa they would like to see and imagine that future and reinventing the South Africa into what they want. And they come up with projects that they execute. In Naturina, in the south of Joburg, a few weeks ago, we had a democracy builder where a community realized that they had an open plot of land for 27 years that was allocated for a clinic. That community then decided they had tried every means possible to get government to commit to the thing. What they then just decided was to put down a plan to get a mobile clinic installed. And within 5 weeks, after 27 years, there is now a mobile clinic in that community. And guess what? Government had to actually bring that mobile clinic there. So there's a broad range of tools that we could be using, and should be supporting. And because we don't support the action that is, again, constructive on a daily basis, we end up with protest.
Okay. So it seems like we'll I'll score, because I'm judge and jury, I'll score this one a draw, because it seems to me that protests are easy to deal with. If you're the government, you
just wait it out.
Just wait it out, right?
And that is where we've come to in many instances, where we're waiting out protesters and protests. And that's why it's insufficient. It's necessary, but insufficient.
Clearly, one route that seems to work, especially with our current ANC government, and that is that when a community actually gets themselves organized and does whatever it is they would have protested about, the government is then very quick to act. I'll give you a couple of, you gave the example of the clinic. I mean, on a minor level, living here in Joburg, and if you're watching this from another part of South Africa, I would urge you to come to Joburg, but make sure you come in a 4x4, because you're going to hit a few potholes. The idea emerged to paint around the potholes and put ANC next to it, and suddenly all those potholes got filled, right, because of the bad press, one would imagine. But clearly the government hates it when communities do things for themselves.
Well, I mean, I think the government, whether the government hates it or not, I think we could have various debates about what they're responding to, right? Governments could be shamed into doing the right thing.
It's hard to shame an African politician, eh? Very hard to shame an African politician. Never seen it yet.
It's part of the reason why I said could be.
Yeah.
I don't think that shame is the right route here. I think we've tried to shame each other, and I think that politicians around the world are impervious to shame often. So if you think about what happened in the UK last year, where you had 3 different prime ministers in a short turnaround time, I can promise you that Boris Johnson was not shamed into leaving. I mean, he's done a whole lot of things that have hit the headlines that, on a morality test would have shamed him before that.
Well,
what happened was that constituencies of the MPs that are in the Conservative Party said to those people, you will lose your MP seat if you do not throw out Boris, if you don't turn around Boris. And so shame is a very fickle thing in any political space.
But it works. Yeah, and you're given a perfect example of where it did work. You could never shame, it was impossible to shame Jacob Zuma. Seems to be impossible
they didn't shame Boris out of a job.
They did.
They've used political power.
Yes, by shaming the MPs that would have kept him in the job.
No, they didn't shame the MPs. They threatened them with recall because the UK allows constituencies who have voted for somebody into a member of parliament seat to be able to recall them. They threaten them with political consequences.
Yes.
We think it's shame. It's not shame.
It's political.
It is political consequences. The same is true for voters. You have political parties walking around trying to shame voters into voting. It's your fault that the ANC is still here. Hey. No, that's not how you get anybody into a political process. People want to return to the ballot if they know that their vote will be consequential. If they know that if once I vote, what happens with my vote afterwards? People want to know that once somebody is in power, they can hold them accountable. So I would say to all of those political parties shaming people or trying to shame voters by saying, you know, the ANC is still in power because you refuse to vote. Ask themselves why, if you're an option, people aren't voting for you yet. Maybe you aren't putting something on the table that is politically valuable enough to the voter.
Okay, so let's stick with that, because that's obviously sort of the real reason that you're sitting here, is that we are heading towards probably South Africa's most important election ever in 2024.
Sure.
And, you know, it's far more important, to my mind, than the 1994 election, which was symbolic, but we kind of knew it was important to have, but we kind of knew where the country was going to. By the time those elections rolled around, there was no great surprise. It was just a wonderful occasion, more than a political process.
Sure.
And we've had the honeymoon period, and the husband was caught cheating now, right? So we've now going to have the 2024 election, where the chairs are going to be rearranged on this deck of this particular Titanic called South Africa. Do you think that those disaffected voters understand the gravity of the next election?
I think disaffected voters understand the gravity of the election, and that's part of the reason why many of them are thinking of staying away. And somebody said it yesterday in response to a video where I speak about the direction of the country, and said part of the reason why, as well-meaning South Africans of all, you know, races, class groups, we're not getting involved in politics, is because we don't want our names next to the next failure. And we worry that the way the system is set up, the way the players in the space are showing up, that if we show up, we're just being complicit in a system that is going to fail often and over again with new people. Because, in fact, one of the things I argue...
I don't want to interrupt you. Do you think there's any logic to that argument? Because I don't understand how you can say the country's so stuffed that whatever we do, it's still going to be stuffed afterwards, therefore I'm not voting. I don't understand the logic that drives that. Do you?
The logic that drives that for people is quite simple.
Yeah.
Is that the politics of the country is in the hands of very few people. And the power of the country is in the hands of very few people. A part of that is our electoral system, which has given parties and party bosses more power than the electorate, right? Because we only vote in parties.
Once elected.
No, not only once elected, right? Even if you think about the ways in which money works in politics. In order to get mass mobilization of people, and that's what an election is, you're trying to mass mobilize people towards a particular cause. Parties get to do that because they'll get funding. The general electorate is not getting funding to self-organize, to have conversations about, who we're going to vote for, to organize outside of parties. The general electorate feel alone. So they feel like they're going there by themselves, and their one vote is going to just, fall into a sea. I've been saying to people, we must start thinking about, as the electorate, we must start thinking about voting as a group project, because that's what the political parties do. They treat it like a group project, and then they get the resources, and their mass funding, and their mass organizing, and all sorts of things in order to get their votes in order. And I think we as the electorate must start thinking about it from our sides and say, let's get our voting in order. Let's, as a community that lives here, get together and start having a conversation about our vote. Nobody goes into a group project. If you are at school or at varsity, you go into a group project, you guys come together and you say, okay, we want to get the best mark possible. And then we just go to our separate houses until the day of the assignment submission and then submit without having a conversation. Yet in this country, we don't want to talk about our vote. We don't want to challenge each other on why are you voting like that and I'm voting like this. What are the bare minimum basics that we need in order to give our vote to somebody? What is the issues that are on the table? What's the agenda for this election? What am I going to exchange my vote for? Can we all decide that we've decided the basic income grant is our non-negotiable as the electorate. And if somebody doesn't have that on their manifesto, they won't get our vote. And if somebody does have it on their manifesto, they will get our vote. We are going to have to start having meaningful conversations and organizing the electorate to vote together, to vote better, to vote differently, rather than just leaving it up to the politicians. Somebody has said politics is too important to be left up to politicians. I think we've left it up to the politicians because our systems encourage that. Where money goes encourages that. I mean, ask the funders who are funding political parties why they aren't funding the electorate and the electorate's power to vote. And that's because they know there's an upside for them if they keep power in the hands of the politicians and they can control those politicians. There's not an upside for them if the electorate are more empowered and the electorate can boot out a politician at will that some big business guy has invested R1 billion into.
We've seen that get even worse recently, and that is that big business with their resources and money have put their support right behind the ANC, haven't they, by meeting with government to try and sort out the issues that the government won't do. That is business saying, thank you very much, we will fund you by making you look good ahead of next election. Isn't that what big business has done? They've openly supported the incumbents.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two big business issues that I have around that. One is big business doing even more than that, hedging their bets across political parties and political actors on many sides. This kind of new compact process that we're starting to see unfold in the presidency, that's the thing that you're talking about. That in itself is quite interesting because it's not new, right? If you think about something like the Youth Employment Service a few years ago, that was a big business initiative that literally propped up Cyril Ramaphosa's path to the presidency. This is not new. It is one of the things we don't do is we don't hold business accountable for their political choices. We actually allow business to get away with not talking about their politics. If you go to the US, with all of the US system flaws, one of the things is because of lobby groups and PACs, you start actually getting a line of sight of what business is putting the money on the table for. Here, business gets to write blank checks. They get to not be held accountable for who they're funding, and they don't get to be asked questions about what is it that you're paying for when you pay R1 million to sit next to the president at a dinner. We're not having that conversation at all, and it's an important conversation because if we're going to build ethical politics, not only are we going to have to talk about what people are paying for, but we also have to devolve power away from just where the money is. And the electorate need to feel like, with or without money, their vote also matters in the political conversation. And part of the difficulty I have with businesses' approach to this, right? And whether it's in this new social compacting, where is community in that conversation? So you're just going to come in as business with your money and, direct government's actions in one way or the other. But communities actually need that money more. Communities need to be part of that conversation on how that money will be spent if it's going to be spent inside government. Otherwise, it will be used just to prop up the ANC. The other big issue that I have with the way in which business has come into the South African conversation, and private sector, and even the middle classes, all of us, is that we have given up on the state unless the state is acting at our behest. And we have opted out of and bought our way out of the state, right? Part of the reason why business is getting involved right now in the ways that it is because of load shedding. We know that. The middle classes are louder than we've been in years because of load shedding, because something is affecting us that we have not been able to figure out how to buy our way out of. But the education system has been terrible for years. But because as the middle classes, we have figured out how to privatize education sufficiently, we have bought our way out of that problem. We've bought our way out of a failing health system. We've even bought our way out of potholes. And the more we buy our way out of governance failures, the less we care about the quality of government for the majority.
Although one could easily say that trend is global, right? It's happened in countries, and South Africans, in my experience, tend to have quite an idealistic idea about what happens in the first world. But that's a trend that's been going for ages. And I mean, I point to Britain, for example, very justifiably proud of the National Health Service. But there's an absolutely thriving private health service that has boomed over the last generation, right? And yeah, you're meant to get great healthcare at National Health Service in the UK, but yet moneyed people are going for private healthcare. You know, the security industry in the United Kingdom has become a massive part of life, with the same keypads and the same eyes and door cameras, etc. Where that, you know, us in South Africa think, well, they've got an effective police service. But what you really have is people with money will buy their way out of government, even when the government is relatively efficient.
So let's start with, you are able to do that and enabled to do that when you actually have viable choices. Right now, we don't have viable choices. So we're buying our way out, even though we know that almost because we don't have viable choices, right?
I don't think so. I think because I don't think so because this is a trend that predates the collapse of some of these services. They predate the new South Africa, talking about the old middle class, right? Where you can go back to the 1980s, and there was already a boom in private schooling. There was already a boom in private security, right? That was with the so-called efficient system for that part of the market then. I don't think this is a question of necessarily, I think this thing has to be revisited purely because when you have the money, you would opt out of the system anyway. So perhaps you have to think about it.
That's where I was going to.
Yeah.
More equal societies create the basis that I can without money live a life where I can have my basic human rights met. Therefore, then once I have access to more money, I can then have access to different choices, and then you create choice around that. But in a context like ours, with high levels of deprivation, high levels of poverty, and the highest levels of inequality in the world, when you are doing that, when you don't have an option for water from the municipality in the majority of places in this country, you are forced to buy water. And the majority of people don't have the money to buy that water. So the more we're creating our private spaces and our private services and opting out of government in this context, we are actually creating a deeper crisis, because the majority of people don't have those options. They are choosing between bad services and bad services, death and death, right? We really, if you think about the rest of the world, the way in which Western Europe, particularly, if you think about particularly the Nordic countries, have gotten into the situation that they are in, is because at base level, you do not need to have money to have access to basic services, and that is a function of government. It's a function of government policies. Even in countries where you've seen conservative governments take over, right? They've not touched the social wage. They've not touched the way in which the social welfare base works, because they know that even those rich people would revolt against that, because they know that the consequences of that are dire for the society they're in. The beauty of being in a Scandinavian country and being able to buy private healthcare is because you know the bottom is going to fall out. But if the bottom fell out, it doesn't matter how much private healthcare you build. If you don't have a country, you don't have a country.
Yes.
So the trend is around a strong government enables people to then build strong private sector. If you've decided you're not going to invest into having a strong government, you're not going to have a functional state, you're not going to do all of that, and you're going to try and build just a private sector on its own, that private sector will run out of a country for its base. It will collapse anyway.
Yeah. So, with this all being said, now you're as we started, you're a democracy builder and so on. How does the answer then? Surely all roads lead to change the current government, because they, as you put it in something that you released on social media, or was released for you, we're kind of letting the drunk guy drive the bus, aren't we, towards the cliff?
And I will extend that, because the current guy is part of the current system. and the current ways in which we allow people to enter into politics, right? So the current guy absolutely must go. Listen, the ANC needs to take a break from all of us. They keep telling us that, they're trying to get their house in order. I think they might need to go and do that on their own time, with their own money and their own resources. Maybe we need to book them an island for all 600,000 of their members, and they can sort themselves out. They just mustn't do it on our time. I don't have time to fix the country and the ANC. ANC members need to make the choice between saving the country and saving the ANC. I don't need to make that choice at all. The bigger point, though, is that we're going to have to get South Africans who care, who are competent, who have the right ethics, who are rooted in community. And rooted in community is a really important part of the criteria. Because also what we've seen with the ANC is that we've been governed by people, and the DA actually as well, we've been governed by people who don't know the country that they're running. The ANC leaders have been in a socio-economic bubble, a political and economic bubble, since they came into power. Cyril Ramaphosa has not lived in this country. Sure. He's not lived here. He's been a billionaire for the greater part of post-democratic South Africa. Does not know what it means to be a black impoverished person in this version of this country. And so we need people who are rooted in community to raise their hands to lead, because the solutions that we need are not just in the heads of rich people, powerful people, smart people, people in academia, people in what we call blue chip civil society. The solutions that we need are in the hearts and minds of people facing the most harsh problems. And until we have leaders that are rooted in community, representing those communities in a real substantive way, we will all fail, and political parties have not shown a commitment to that at all.
What we do know about what Cyril Ramaphosa does know about communities is he can go to a community where he has failed, where he's killed people, Hammanskraal, right, where his government has killed people by not by allowing the water treatment plant to go to get into disrepute. But what he does know is that he goes into an area that he's failed, and people meet him ululating and cheering, and he's almost hoisted shoulder high into a community where he's killed people, right?
Well,
where his government has killed people. So
because
therefore,
he's in a culture.
How do we break that culture, and how successful have you been at it?
So I'll answer that question for sure. I want us to reckon with the fact that we have created the celebrity politician. The moment we made Nelson Mandela into this historic figure and heroic figure and all of the things that we did with this, the iconography of Nelson Mandela, we made politicians into godlike figures in this country. We have participated in that. Because the truth is, if we were still talking about a Nelson Mandela walking into that context, we would be unsurprised that people respond that way, even if the ANC was failing. Because we have created a particular kind of celebrity around that person. So we must all recognize that we've done that, right? If Cyril Ramaphosa goes to a dinner with business people, I'm sure we've been to those before, they also treat him like a celebrity. People are also excited to see him and want to take a photo, even though yesterday they were talking trash about his governance around the braai. We don't treat politicians as if they are servants of the people. We treat them as if they are celebrities. We have created that in our minds. One day you're knocking on my door asking me to hire you and vote for you, and then the next day you're not willing to take my call, even though I was the one that hired you. We need to reconfigure that. And there are two ways dead on that we can do that. Number one is we need to give people back the power to engage with politicians directly, right? And Parliament is that vehicle. We have not thought enough and spoken enough in this country about the state of Parliament. Parliament should be a place that represents communities, where I, as an individual, should be able to know parliamentarians well enough that when they're voting, I have some level of access to them.
You're talking constituencies.
I'm talking constituencies, but I'm also just talking responsiveness. I'm talking about some kind of system that makes MPs actually accountable to us. Ask any, and I'm talking about people who are very politically literate, people who are following politics. Ask them to name 10 parliamentarians who've not been ministers before. they will struggle. We don't know our MPs. We don't know their names. They draw salaries. We don't know what their work is. We don't know what they do. And then we get surprised when they're...
But we do know how they're going to vote.
Right. We only know how they're going to vote, and we don't even know their names, right? And so we must disrupt that system. No. We must absolutely disrupt that, and we must hold MPs, MPLs, councillors much more directly accountable as people. There's a community in Khayelitsha that's doing this at the ward level, where they've got an ward councillor elected, and they send a delegation from that community to council meetings with him every council meeting, so that he cannot bamboozle them for a moment about what's happening there, and they take his scorecard about the way he's going to vote on things. That's the level of engagement we need at all spheres of our representation.
Now, Tessa, just in closing, I've had many people sitting in that very chair, many of them politicians, leaders of parties, some of the new parties, etc., and they're always saying one thing to me: please don't think that our electorate are stupid. Don't think that that South African voters are just dumb voters. They are very politically aware, right? They're not just going to give their vote. They are, and they wax lyrical about the political understanding of South Africans of all economic strata. But you're saying something quite different.
No, I'm not saying anything different.
Well, surely what you're saying is that you're talking about having to educate the voters, right, with their choices, holding people accountable, etc., right? With the implication being that they don't understand that if they just return the ANC, then we're going to get the same outcome. Now, who's out of touch? Is it just the thing to say on politicians when they say, you know, the voter's not that stupid. They're not just going to vote. They're going to remember this, and they're going to do that, and they're going to do this, and they're not just going to vote because it's the ANC, etc. Are they wrong when they say that? Or are you wrong when you're saying people need to be educated?
I'm not saying people need to be educated.
About the implication of their vote is what I'm talking about. No, not educated.
I'm actually not saying that. Okay. I think there is an education piece around voter education, around civic power. I think voters need to be organized, not educated. I think the education will come with being more organized, because people need to engage each other more. So I think voters know things. I mean, they're reading, they're understanding, they live the conditions of their lives that they know are a direct implication of political choices. What voters need to do is be empowered to organize themselves to get plugged into their role in political power. Voters need political power. They need to know that they can have political power. They need to know how they can use their political power, but they're not going to figure that out by the IEC coming to educate them on voting processes. They're going to figure that out by organizing themselves and starting to engage. That's what voters need. They need more opportunities to be more engaged. And that's going to come with a lot of organizing, a lot of support from civil society, from business, from all sorts of strata of society. But voters don't need to be educated as much as they need to be organized.
Well, Tessa, good luck in your quest to organize our voters, because, good heavens, we need a different outcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
If you've enjoyed this conversation in the State of the Nation, please subscribe to the channel. And don't forget, we are going to be holding the State of the Nation Business Breakfast on the 10th of July at the Sandton Convention Centre, where we'll have a number of the leaders of certainly the opposition parties, John Steenhuisen, Herman Mashaba, Musi Maimani, a few analysts, including Davy Root, going to be there putting some questions to them. If you want more information, just look below this video. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you the next time on the State of the Nation. Tessa, thank you very much.
Thank you.